सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
It's a particularly complex episode of Cut the Clutter. Why? Because one, we are talking about two completely different geographies. There are two issues here, but two completely different geography and two completely different geopolitical situations with no real bearing on each other, but with lots of interesting ideological commonalities and some ideological contradictions. So we are talking about what's happening in Latin America, Southern America, particularly with the Brazilian election result, the first round, and also with Putin's remarkable speech last week that somehow got missed out in our media in its detail because it happened over the weekend and also because our media, we included, tend to get very focused internally, very focused on our own politics and what's happening here because our politics is also fun. But you know what? This is a globalized world. Everything that happens anywhere in the world affects us. So we have Brazilian election where in the first round, the former leftist president of Brazil, even now a leftist leader of Workers' Party, that is Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, usually called Lula, 76-year-old, he has won the first round. He has won the first round but hasn't fully won anything because in the Brazilian system, in the first round, where many candidates contest, one has to get at least 50% to get elected. So he was running way ahead of the incumbent, that is Jair Bolsonaro. So why do we say he's beaten Bolsonaro but not quite beaten Bolsonaro? Because he's got 48.3% of the vote and Bolsonaro has got 43.3% of the vote. That's a clear 5 percentage vote difference over a base of 11.5 crore people who voted. If you count total numbers, then roughly 5.72 crore people have voted for Lula and 5.1 crore people have voted for Bolsonaro. So you would have thought that on this base, this is a lot of margin, he should win. But that's not how it works in Brazil. In Brazil, because many candidates participate in the first round, unlike the Indian system, which is first past the post, which means even if 200 candidates contest, the one with the highest numbers wins. Not in Brazil for president. In Brazil, a candidate to become president in the first round has to win at least 50% of the vote or above 50% of the vote. And if that doesn't happen, then there is a runoff or a second round or a final round. So now a final round will take place on 30th October because Lula fell short of 50%, and the final round will have just two candidates. That is the number 1 and number 2 in the first round. So that will be Lula versus Bolsonaro again, who is the incumbent, and this will be again a month of campaigning and a big fight going ahead. So there are issues emerging from that I will mention to you because this is also that juncture in history where Latin Southern America is taking one more ideological turn. What is that ideological turn? That it takes every few decades, it goes left to right or right to left. So last time it happened, say about more than 20 years ago, it was said that this region, the Americas, not North America, they had a pink tide. So a lot of these leftist leaders came up and lots of notable leftist leaders emerged. There was Hugo Chavez, for example, who was also a big star with the left in India. In fact, when he came to India in the UPA rule, he was treated like a hero. And if you want, you can check out the videos of his visit to JNU and so many young people shouting red salute, etc., etc. He fell by the wayside. His legatees are still there in Venezuela, though struggling. But the fact is that over this period, this pink tide had been washed out by the rise of the ideological right in Latin and South America, and nobody represented this more than Jair Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, or one who was elected president of Brazil in 2018. It's a 4-year term, so he's coming for his first re-election right now and is in trouble. All opinion polls put him 14 percentage points behind Lula. But in the final poll, he's turned out much closer. So the gap is not 14% or 10% or 8%. If that was even 7%, if that was the case, then a second round would not be needed. And Lula and his supporters would be celebrating right now. And they were expecting to win. That's why they were in the towns, in the capital's main square, in their red clothing, drinking beer, red caps, hoping to celebrate. But they have to hold their beer for now. At least for another month, and then we'll see what happens in the next one, because Bolsonaro has a chance of turning this around. Now, as you're reading this out, you will also see that in the past 5 years, this rightward turn has reversed in this region. And of the elections held in the past 5 years, in 7 major countries, in 6 leaders or parties of the left have come to power. So a pink tide has again returning. So that is the one big story. So one strongman of the nationalist right looks like he's in trouble, and looks like the left is staging a comeback in southern Latin America. At the other end of the geography, you have to turn the globe, in fact, almost fully, to see what's happening in Russia. So what happened in Russia last week was this speech by Putin, where he again seemed angry. He's delivered many angry speeches since February, after which he invaded Ukraine. But this is by far the angriest. And he said some really nasty things. I will take you through many of those and also tell you what those things mean. Now, ideologically, the important thing is, you might say the left is rising in Latin Southern America. At the same time, you can say that one nationalist right is losing. But see what's happening in Europe. In Europe, just last week, we had talked about the fact that the right nationalists or nationalists of the right are rising. So in Italy, there is Giorgia Meloni. In Sweden, there is a coalition of the right. Sweden, of all places, Sweden is kind of the Vatican or the Mecca of socialism, right? So in Europe, from the north to the south, Sweden is north of Europe, Italy is south of Europe. You see the ideological right rising. Latin America, you see ideological right losing, ideological left rising. And then you have Putin speaking. Now, if you see how Putin's speaking, and I will take you through that, it would look like basically Putin is speaking the language of the left. Putin is saying stuff that the left would love. And that is the reason I said this is a particularly complex episode of Cut the Clutter, because this is a world which can only be described as in the young Indian lyricist Jaideep Sahni's lines, "Ye duniya ut patanga." Remember from that film, Khosla ka Ghosla? "Ye duniya ut patanga, kithe ladte kithe danga, kithe kukdi dendi banga," etc., etc. It was a funny song, but basically it said the world is upside down, the world is turned upside down, inside out, doesn't make sense. And in this, geopolitics, ideology, geography, warfare, military science, populism, socialism, they've all got mixed up. And out of this mishmash, you are trying to make sense of this world. And you know what? If you're trying to make sense of a world as complex as this, you need one good ally. And that one good ally is with skills, a large heart, an open mind, and patience. The most important thing that's lacking today in our profession, journalism, is patience. So that ally is good journalism. And good journalism cannot survive unless you pay for it. So once again, it's my humble appeal to you. Please take a paid subscription to ThePrint. We try and come up to your expectations. If you don't, please tell us. If you do, also please tell us. And because good journalism is of such value to you, you can also see that good journalism costs money, and you have to keep it going. You have to keep it going. We'll try to come up to your expectations. So please do take a subscription, a paid subscription to ThePrint. As I speak, you will see a demonstration on my screen of how this is to be done. It just takes you just a few seconds. And I am also sharing a link with you with the description of today's video, so you know how to do it. You have to keep us going. Without that, it is an impossibility. And you know what? We will always try to come up to your expectations. If you think we are doing our jobs all right, send us a word of praise. Who doesn't like praise? But if you think there is something we are not doing right or not coming up to your expectations or doing something wrong, please let us know. So while we love and enjoy praise, we value healthy criticism even more. That said, back to our complex situation right now. So you see a situation in the southern part of America where the left is rising. That part is also very sexy. It holds a special sex appeal for the global left because that's where some of the stars of the global left come in. Some of the stars with whose pictures young leftists wear t-shirts, right? That is Castro, Chavez, Che Guevara, etc., etc. Now, that is where you might get a heady feeling again if you're a supporter of the left that the left is rising there. But from whatever I read, it's a different kind of left. First of all, Lula, who was a trade union leader. Brazil is a very large country. Brazil is a very large country in terms of population, about 22 crores, a Pakistan-sized country. A Pakistan-sized country or a population the size of Uttar Pradesh. Uttar Pradesh and Pakistan are the same, but enormously bigger in terms of area. So if you look at the area, it's 8.5 million square kilometers. So you can imagine 8.5 million square kilometers, whereas India, all of India, is 3.2 million square kilometers. So this population is less than a sixth of India, but the area is 2.5 times of India, that large. In fact, if you look at Uttar Pradesh, the population is the same as Uttar Pradesh or thereabouts, but the area is almost 30 times as large as Uttar Pradesh. So it's a very large country. And you know what? 80% of the entire Amazon region falls in Brazil. What that means is Brazil has enormous amounts of forest wealth, which it holds in trust for the rest of the world. Because if climate change has to go north or south, it will depend very much on what happens to the Amazon forests, particularly in Brazil. Now, Bolsonaro, he's been particularly quote unquote liberal in allowing the chopping of those forests by millions of hectares. Millions of hectares. It's not 100 trees or 200 trees or 300 trees or 10,000 trees or 2 million trees. Millions of hectares to allow mining, to allow other industrialization or other activity. And that's caused a lot of stress in the whole world. Lula, on the other hand, has given up his extreme leftist, socialist rhetoric, distributive rhetoric, because some of that got him into trouble the last time, and I'll tell you what happened then with him and the other leaders of the left in the America, who then lost out and created space for leaders of the nationalist right to move in. But he also is now talking more about preserving the forests. He's not saying he will not allow any development there, but he's saying he'll be a lot more restrained. So if I read up all the details of what kind of left is now coming to power in Latin South America, this left is not so much the left of the past. It's not really the old, original, harsh, distributive left of the past. This is a different kind of left, which has now appealed to the younger people, millennials and others, mainly by claiming to be more positive on concerns on climate change and also being more environment friendly. So you can say that the new pink tide in South America isn't so much a pink tide as it is actually a green tide. And that is the big change that tells you the entire ideology. It's not as if it's just a shift from ideological right to ideological left, but ideological left has also changed. Just as ideological right has changed globally in the last 10 years or so, it's become much more nationalist, much more protectionist, and has gone much closer to religion. But it has given up mostly on one tenet of the old right-wing politics, which is to be liberal and open on the economy. So the global right over the past 10 years has actually lost the one thing that someone like me would consider would be the right, which is liberal economics. Now they've all turned protectionists, and that protectionism marries quite neatly with their kind of nationalism. And how important is Bolsonaro for this club of strongmen of the nationalist right across the world. He's got Trump, Netanyahu, many others actually endorsing him publicly. And Trump is very important because a lot of the Brazilians vote in America. So in all the cities you can see in America where Trump won in his election, Bolsonaro has also swept those cities. And the cities where Trump lost, Bolsonaro is also losing. So you can see that whole left-right American divide also casting its shadow on Brazil or vice versa. On the other hand, the left, you can see now in all these countries, the left is shifting from pink to green. So there is a greening of the left. And that is the other fascinating change that you can see. You might ask me that you said 6 of the 7 major countries in this region have chosen the left in the past 5 years. So I'll just give you a quick list. Alberto Fernando in Argentina, 2019, left. Luis Ars, Bolivia, 2020, left. Gabriel Boric, Chile. In fact, we had a whole Cut the Clutter episode on that. Gabriel Boric, Chile, left, 2022. Colombia, Gustavo Petro, center left, same straight line. Honduras, Xiamo Castro, 2021, again left. And Peru, Pedro Castillo, also of the left. Now, these are people of the left. On the right, there is a dodgy character, and that dodgy character is in Nicaragua. That is Jose Daniel Ortega Savadera in Nicaragua, who's been getting elected all the time, but his election has generally been called a sham. So he's got elected, but you know what? He's a leader of the right who's changed. It was in his favor that Reagan bent all the laws, Reagan White House bent all the laws, and then that infamous Iran-Contra scam took place in the 80s. He's an old man. But he now says that my opponents are gringos who want to sell my country to the Americans. So once again, I told you, dunya ut patanga. So one leader of the right in this region is actually cursing America. Now, I had mentioned to you that in the past, the left in this region had taken resort to heavy distributive populism. Now, first of all, that populism has been snatched away by the nationalist right almost across the world, including in India. Modi government is carrying out much better distribution of surpluses or what it sees as surpluses to the poor than any socialist government had done in India. So nationalists of the right have taken away that populism. But the important thing about the left in South Latin America is that their last wave of populism was driven by commodity prices. Because these countries have huge commodities from oil. In fact, it was the Brazilian public sector oil giant Petrobras, wherein lay this big scandal, or what was called the car wash scandal. And why was it car wash scandal? Simply because the first indications that such a scandal was brewing came at a car wash center. That aside, that scandal led to the prosecution and jailing of former President Lula for 580 days. But the fact is that that wave of left had risen in the region because commodity prices had gone up. So there was copper, there was lithium, nickel, lots of commodities, lots of minerals are found in that vast geographical region. As the prices went up, these populists of the left then had the surpluses in the cash to distribute it. And as usual, these things don't end well, and most of these countries went into crisis of one kind or the other, and no country illustrates it better than Venezuela. Venezuela has the largest crude oil reserves in the world, and they were just pumping it out and selling it and distributing it. And one day commodity prices started going down, and all this left populism got wiped out. Now commodity prices have gone up again. Right has cracked the code of riding the commodity price cycles and carrying out distribution. So that is the big change. The other thing that I find of interest was in India, the whole story of Lula's prosecution and jailing. He wrote an article in the Washington Post about it himself, and I'm sharing a link with you, where he mentioned how he was targeted. And you know what? There was an activist judge there or an activist prosecutor who was going after scandals and catching the guilty, a kind of Lokpal, you might say, of Brazil. His name was Judge Sergio Moro. Judge Sergio Moro went after Lula, took him to conviction, had him locked up in jail, and soon enough, as Bolsonaro came to power, what happened to Sergio Moro? He was appointed the justice minister in the cabinet. Later, Lula got acquitted and he's now fighting and he's the front runner. But you know what? Does it remind you of something that happened in our country? Just replace the car wash scam with the 2G scam. And remember who it was who went after the previous UPA government, and after UPA government went out and NDA government came into power, and that gentleman also got rewarded big time. It also so happens that all those accused in that scam also have got acquitted, although appeals are pending, prosecution appeals are pending in the high courts right now. So once again, there's a little parallel which I thought I'll mention to you. Now we swing back to Putin and Russia. So Putin delivered this speech. I can do no better than read out some highlights that a brilliant guy called Konstantin Kisin, if you see his Twitter bio, he's a comedian, but he says he's been a professional translator for 10 years. And now that I've read translations everywhere of Putin's speech, I know that the highlights he's taken out are correct and accurate. So I am sharing his Twitter thread with you. As I speak, his Twitter thread will run on my screen also. I will not reading all of it. I'm just telling you the highlight with a little bit of gyan from my side. So first of all, he says point number 1, West is greedy and aims to enslave other nations like Russia. Putin is saying that. Number 2, West is leveraging the power of finance and technology to collect a hegemon tax. So the West becomes a hegemon and collects this tax from the rest of the world. It creates terrorist enclaves, deprives other countries of sovereignty. This is a full-on condemnation by Putin. If you are against him, you will say it's a meltdown. If you are with him, you will say fantastic, well done, shabash. And you know what? What surprises me, what I find so cute, that India perhaps is the one country besides maybe China where there is such a large fan following for Vladimir Putin. So I think a lot of people in India will say, shabash, kya zabardast तकरीर दिया, क्या स्पीच दिया आपने, आपकी तो रिटोरियल स्किल्स की दाद देने वाली है, राइट? अमेरिका को आपने ठोक दिया, अमेरिका को आपने ख़त्म कर दिया. So he says America and the West are collecting a hegemon tax by leveraging their power of finance and technology. Then they say America and the West have launched a hybrid war on Russia. They want Russia to become a colony. We will not become a mob of soulless slaves. Then he says this rules-based order that the West talks about is nonsense. Who made these rules? Who agreed to these rules? We are an ancient civilization in Russia. We'll never live by these rigged rules. Then he says the West is totalitarian, despotic, and let me see if I can pronounce this right, apartheidistic. Maybe he says something else in Russian, but in translation it comes out like that. The West is racist. Why is it racist? Because Russophobia is racism. And he says the West calls itself civilized. Civilized? Who started global slave trade? Who killed so many Native Americans through genocide? Who pillaged India and Africa? Now full-on anti-colonial at this point. Forced China to buy opium through opium wars. We, on the other hand, launched many anti-colonial movements which helped a lot of the countries end inequality and poverty. It's tricky because what does he mean, we? Usually he's not a fan of the communist era or the Soviet era. In this case, he's harking back to the Soviet era. So you know what? Sometimes you can pick and choose your arguments, particularly when you're ideology agnostic. If your ideology is just nationalism, religion, and populism, then you have a lot of leeway to move left, right, up, down, center, back, anywhere. And that's what he's doing right now. He says the West hates Russia. It's been pillaging Russia. They've been trying to break Russia since the 17th century. Towards the end of the 20th century, once again, he's going back to the breaking down of the Soviet Empire. He says at the end of the 20th century, they got an opportunity to loot the Russians, and that they did and shipped out trillions of dollars of wealth out of Russia. Now that is changing, he says. Then he goes on, a unipolar world is undemocratic by its very nature. It's a lie The Western powers use nukes, Americans use the nukes. They set a precedent. In fact, his exact line, if I get it right, is in a way they set a precedent. So that is supposed to scare everybody into thinking that he's saying now that the Americans set a precedent with Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he could also do something like that. Then they said they flattened German cities after the Second World War, for which there was no need, but the only reason they did that was to scare other countries. And we saw the results in Korea, in Vietnam, etc. And he said the Americans to date occupied Japan and Germany and called them allies, which is a sham. Americans in Western world are indulging in bioweapons research, surveillance of leaders of other countries, and this whole talk of containment of Iran, Russia and China is all rubbish. So he's now dragged China and Iran in his group in a way. Then he says, you can't serve your people by printing dollars and using social media. Now he's mocking the West. You need food and energy. You've caused this food and energy crisis. So once again, these are his leverages. His leverages are gas and oil prices and also the surplus food grain that he and Ukraine export to the world. So he is reminding them of that. Then he's appealing to his socially conservative constituency. And remember, this is something very similar to what Giorgia Meloni has been saying in Italy. He said they are the ones who created this whole gender controversy, this whole gender issue. Now they say parent 1 and parent 2. And they say you can transition through gender. Is such a thing possible? Do we want your children? Do we want our children growing like that? So he's appealing to his conservative constituency also. And he says, look, breaking of the West's hegemony was inevitable. We are now doing it. So the West's hegemony is now being broken, says Putin. And he says, we as in Russians, we are breaking it. It was inevitable. It's happening. Neocolonialism will be defeated. Now, you know what? I had said to you earlier on that this is so confusing because the preeminent leader of the nationalist right now is speaking the language which carries the fragrance of the classical left. That's the reason I said that this situation in the world is even more confusing ideologically than it is geopolitically. So again, the upshot of this speech is that the war in Ukraine, his invasion of Ukraine now is indicating is not about NATO or Ukraine. This is about Putin wanting to create a new world order. And as Putin goes out to set a new world order, or he thinks he's going out to set a new world order, and a lot of the world then gets together to try and stop him and fights him directly and indirectly. Some of the world sits in confusion. You find also these big ideological shifts taking place all across the world, where right borrows from left, the left goes from red to green, and so on and so forth. This is a very interesting world.